Ancient Greek philosophy began around the 6th century BC, emerging as a way to understand the world through reasoning rather than relying solely on myths and religious beliefs. It delved into a wide array of subjects, including astronomy, mathematics, politics, ethics, metaphysics, and more. Over time, Greek philosophy became deeply ingrained in Western culture, influencing various aspects of public education and intellectual discourse. Alfred North Whitehead famously remarked that much of European philosophical tradition can be seen as building upon the ideas laid down by Plato, highlighting the enduring significance of Greek thought. While Greek philosophers drew inspiration from earlier wisdom literature and cosmogonies of the ancient Near East, they distinguished themselves by their commitment to rational inquiry. Despite some influences from other cultures, the Greeks developed their own distinct approach to philosophy. The influence of Socrates, as portrayed by Plato, was so profound that philosophers who preceded him are often referred to as pre-Socratic. Following this period, Greek philosophy underwent further development during the Classical Greek era and later during the Hellenistic period, characterized by the conquests of Alexander the Great and the resulting spread of Greek culture across vast regions. Early Greek philosophy, the convention of terming those philosophers who were active prior to the death of Socrates as the pre-Socratics, gained currency with the 1903 publication of Hermann Diels' Fragment der Vorsokratiker. Although the term did not originate with him, the term is considered useful because what came to be known as the Athenian school, composed of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, signaled the rise of a new approach to philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche's thesis that this shift began with Plato rather than with Socrates, hence his nomenclature of pre-Platonic philosophy, has not prevented the predominance of the pre-Socratic distinction. Since 2016, however, current scholarship has transitioned from calling philosophy before the Athenian school, pre-Socratic, to simply early Greek philosophy. André Lacks and Glenn W. Most have been partly responsible for popularizing this shift in describing the era preceding the Athenian school through their comprehensive, 9-volume Loeb editions of early Greek philosophy. In their first volume, they distinguish their systematic approach from that of Hermann Diels, beginning with the choice of early Greek philosophy over pre-Socratic philosophy, most notably because Socrates as contemporary and sometimes even prior to philosophers traditionally considered pre-Socratic. The early Greek philosophers, or pre-Socratics, were primarily concerned with cosmology, ontology, and mathematics. They were distinguished from non-philosophers, insofar as they rejected mythological explanations in favor of reasoned discourse. Milesian school. Thales of Miletus, regarded by Aristotle as the first philosopher, held that all things arise from a single material substance, water. It is not because he gave a cosmogony that John Burnet calls him the first man of science, but because he gave a naturalistic explanation of the cosmos and supported it with reasons. According to tradition, Thales was able to predict an eclipse and taught the Egyptians how to measure the height of the pyramids. Thales inspired the Milesian school of philosophy and was followed by Anaximander, who argued that the substratum or arche could not be water or any of the classical elements but was instead something unlimited, or indefinite, in Greek, the apeiron. He began from the observation that the world seems to consist of opposites, yet a thing can become its opposite. Therefore, they cannot truly be opposites but rather must both be manifestations of some underlying unity that is neither. This underlying unity could not be any of the classical elements, since they were one extreme or another. For example, water is wet, the opposite of dry, while fire is dry, the opposite of wet. This initial state is ageless and imperishable, and everything returns to it according to necessity. Anaximenes in turn held that the arche was air, although John Burnet argues that by this, he meant that it was a transparent mist, the ether. Despite their varied answers, the Milesian school was searching for a natural substance that would remain unchanged despite appearing in different forms, and thus represents one of the first scientific attempts to answer the question that would lead to the development of modern atomic theory. The Milesians, says Burnet, asked for the physis of all things. Xenophanes. Xenophanes, a prominent figure in ancient Greek philosophy, hailed from Ionia, a region where the Milesian school of thought flourished. This environment likely exposed him to the prevailing cosmological theories of the Milesians. While specific details about his early influences remain unclear, Xenophanes articulated a philosophical perspective that challenged conventional notions of divinity and natural phenomena. Central to Xenophanes, Philosophy was the idea that natural phenomena could be understood through natural rather than divine explanations. This notion mirrored the thoughts of Anaximander, another influential pre-Socratic philosopher. Xenophanes boldly asserted that there was only one God, which he identified with the entirety of the world. This monotheistic conception of divinity represented a departure from the anthropomorphic polytheism characteristic of Greek religious beliefs at the time. In his critique of anthropomorphism, Xenophanes employed humor and satire to ridicule the gods' depiction in Greek religion. He famously remarked that if animals could express their views, they would depict gods in their own likeness. This witty observation underscored his skepticism towards the anthropocentric portrayal of divinity. Despite the scarcity of surviving works attributed to Xenophanes, his philosophical legacy endured. He is recognized as the progenitor of a philosophical lineage that includes Pyrrhonism, a school of skepticism, and possibly influenced the development of Eleatic philosophy. Moreover, Xenophanes' emphasis on rational inquiry and his rejection of anthropomorphic gods laid the groundwork for Epicurus' later advocacy for the separation of science and religion. In summary, Xenophanes' contributions to ancient Greek philosophy resonate through his challenges to conventional beliefs, his monotheistic conception of divinity, and his enduring influence on subsequent philosophical traditions. Pythagoreanism. Pythagoras lived at approximately the same time that Xenophanes did and, in contrast to the latter, the school that he founded sought to reconcile religious belief and reason. Little is known about his life with any reliability, however, and no writings of his survive, so it is possible that he was simply a mystic whose successors introduced rationalism into Pythagoreanism, that he was simply a rationalist whose successors are responsible for the mysticism in Pythagoreanism, or that he was actually the author of the doctrine. There is no way to know for certain. Pythagoras is said to have been a disciple of Anaximander and to have imbibed the cosmological concerns of the Ionians, including the idea that the cosmos is constructed of spheres, the importance of the infinite, and that air or ether is the arche of everything. Pythagoreanism also incorporated ascetic ideals, emphasizing purgation, metempsychosis, and consequently a respect for all animal life. Much was made of the correspondence between mathematics and the cosmos in a musical harmony. Pythagoras believed that behind the appearance of things, there was the permanent principle of mathematics, and that the forms were based on a transcendental mathematical relation. Heraclitus. Heraclitus, an influential figure in ancient Greek philosophy, contributed significantly to the understanding of the nature of reality and the cosmos. His philosophical stance is often encapsulated by the famous phrase, "You cannot step into the same river twice." This assertion underscores his belief in the fundamental principle of change and flux as the essence of existence. For Heraclitus, the universe is in a constant state of flux, with everything in perpetual motion and transformation. He argued that nothing in the world is permanent, instead, all things undergo continuous change. This idea challenges the notion of stability and permanence and suggests that change is the only constant in life. Central to Heraclitus's philosophy is the concept of pantarei, which translates to, everything flows, or, all things are in motion. This concept reflects his belief that the universe is a dynamic and ever-changing entity. He likened the universe to a river, with the flow of water symbolizing the continuous flux and transformation of reality. Moreover, Heraclitus posited that fire is the primary element from which all things originate and to which all things return. He saw fire not only as a physical element but also as a symbol of change, transformation, and the creative force underlying the cosmos. Fire, for Heraclitus, represents the process of transformation and the dynamic nature of existence. In addition to his emphasis on change, Heraclitus proposed the doctrine of the unity of opposites. He argued that opposites are not contradictory but complementary, forming a harmonious unity. According to Heraclitus, the tension between opposites, such as hot and cold, day and night, or life and death, is essential for maintaining balance and order in the universe. Overall, Heraclitus's philosophy offers profound insights into the nature of reality, emphasizing the transient and ever-changing nature of existence. His ideas continue to influence philosophical discourse, particularly in areas such as metaphysics, ontology, and the philosophy of change. Eleatic philosophy. Parmenides of Elea cast his philosophy against those who held, it is and is not the same, and all things travel in opposite directions, presumably referring to Heraclitus and those who followed him. Whereas the doctrines of the Milesian school, in suggesting that the substratum could appear in a variety of different guises, implied that everything that exists is corpuscular, Parmenides argued that the first principle of being was one, indivisible, and unchanging. Being, he argued, by definition implies eternality, while only that which is can be thought, a thing which is, moreover, cannot be more or less, and so the rarefaction and condensation of the Milesians is impossible regarding being. Lastly, as movement requires that something exist apart from the thing moving, the one or being cannot move, since this would require that, space, both exist and not exist. While this doctrine is at odds with ordinary sensory experience, where things do indeed change and move, the Eleatic school followed Parmenides in denying that sense phenomena revealed the world as it actually was. Instead, the only thing with being was thought, or the question of whether something exists or not is one of whether it can be thought. In support of this, Parmenides' pupil Zeno of Elea attempted to prove that the concept of motion was absurd and as such motion did not exist. He also attacked the subsequent development of pluralism, arguing that it was incompatible with being. His arguments are known as Zeno's paradoxes. Pluralism and atomism. Parmenides' logic indeed had a profound impact on subsequent philosophical thought, leading some philosophers to deviate from the monistic views of earlier thinkers like the Milesians, Xenophanes, Heraclitus, and Parmenides himself. Instead of positing a single fundamental substance or principle as the arche, these philosophers adopted pluralistic perspectives. Empedocles and Anaxagoras, for example, embraced pluralism by proposing the existence of multiple elements that were not reducible to one another. Empedocles suggested that these elements were set in motion by love and strife, while Anaxagoras posited that they were propelled by mind. Both philosophers, however, agreed with Parmenides on the notion that there is no true coming into being or passing away. Instead, they argued that the appearance of change is an illusion caused by the rearrangement of unchanging elements. Leucippus, another thinker influenced by Parmenides, introduced an ontological pluralism centered around the concepts of the vacuum and atoms. According to his cosmogony, atoms move through the void, combining and separating to form material bodies. Although Leucippus' ideas were not widely known during his time, they laid the groundwork for the atomic theory later developed by his student, Democritus. This shift towards pluralism marked a departure from the strict monism of earlier philosophers, reflecting a recognition of the complexity and diversity of the natural world. It also paved the way for new avenues of inquiry into the fundamental constituents of reality and the mechanisms governing their interactions. Sophism. Sophism arose from the juxtaposition of physis and nomos. John Burnet posits its origin in the scientific progress of the previous centuries, which suggested that being was radically different from what was experienced by the senses and, if comprehensible at all, was not comprehensible in terms of order. The world in which people lived, on the other hand, was one of law and order, albeit of humankind's own making. At the same time, nature was constant, while what was by law differed from one place to another and could be changed. The first person to call themselves a sophist, according to Plato, was Protagoras, whom he presents as teaching that all virtue is conventional. It was Protagoras who claimed that man is the measure of all things, of the things that they are, and of the things that are not, that they are not, which Plato interprets as a radical perspectivism, where some things seem to be one way for one person and another way for another person, the conclusion being that one cannot look to nature for guidance regarding how to live one's life. Protagoras and subsequent sophists tended to teach rhetoric as their primary vocation. Prodicus, Gorgias, Hippias, and Thrasymachus appear in various dialogues, sometimes explicitly teaching that while nature provides no ethical guidance, the guidance that the laws provide is worthless, or that nature favors those who act against the laws. Classical Greek philosophy. Socrates. Four Greek philosophers: Socrates, Antisthenes, Chrysippos, Epicurus. British Museum. Socrates, believed to have been born in Athens in the 5th century BC, marks a watershed in ancient Greek philosophy. Athens was a center of learning, with sophists and philosophers traveling from across Greece to teach rhetoric, astronomy, cosmology, and geometry. While philosophy was an established pursuit prior to Socrates, Cicero credits him as the first who brought philosophy down from the heavens, placed it in cities, introduced it into families, and obliged it to examine into life and morals, and good and evil. By this account he would be considered the founder of political philosophy. The reasons for this turn toward political and ethical subjects remain the object of much study. The fact that many conversations involving Socrates, as recounted by Plato and Xenophon, end without having reached a firm conclusion, or aporetically, has stimulated debate over the meaning of the Socratic method. Socrates is said to have pursued this probing question-and-answer style of examination on a number of topics, usually attempting to arrive at a defensible and attractive definition of a virtue. While Socrates' recorded conversations rarely provide a definite answer to the question under examination, several maxims or paradoxes for which he has become known recur. Socrates taught that no one desires what is bad, and so if anyone does something that truly is bad, it must be unwillingly or out of ignorance. Consequently, all virtue is knowledge. He frequently remarks on his own ignorance. Plato presents him as distinguishing himself from the common run of mankind by the fact that, while they know nothing noble and good, they do not know that they do not know, whereas Socrates knows and acknowledges that he knows nothing noble and good. The great statesman Pericles was closely associated with this new learning and a friend of Anaxagoras, however, and his political opponents struck at him by taking advantage of a conservative reaction against the philosophers. It became a crime to investigate the things above the heavens or below the earth, subjects considered impious. Anaxagoras is said to have been charged and to have fled into exile when Socrates was about 20 years of age. There is a story that Protagoras, too, was forced to flee and that the Athenians burned his books. Socrates, however, is the only subject recorded as charged under this law, convicted, and sentenced to death in 399 BC, see Trial of Socrates. In the version of his defense speech presented by Plato, he claims that it is the envy he arouses on account of his being a philosopher that will convict him. Numerous subsequent philosophical movements were inspired by Socrates or his younger associates. Plato cast Socrates as the main interlocutor in his dialogues, deriving from them the basis of Platonism and by extension, Neoplatonism. Plato's student Aristotle in turn criticized and built upon the doctrines he ascribed to Socrates and Plato, forming the foundation of Aristotelianism. Antisthenes founded the school that would come to be known as Cynicism and accused Plato of distorting Socrates' teachings. Zeno of Citium in turn adapted the ethics of Cynicism to articulate Stoicism. Epicurus studied with Platonic and Pyrrhonist teachers before renouncing all previous philosophers, including Democritus, on whose atomism the Epicurean philosophy relies. The philosophic movements that were to dominate the intellectual life of the Roman Empire were thus born in this febrile period following Socrates' activity, and either directly or indirectly influenced by him. They were also absorbed by the expanding Muslim world in the 7th through 10th centuries AD, from which they returned to the West as foundations of medieval philosophy and the Renaissance, as discussed below. Plato was an Athenian of the generation after Socrates. Ancient tradition ascribes 36 dialogues and 13 letters to him, although of these only 24 of the dialogues are now universally recognized as authentic. Most modern scholars believe that at least 28 dialogues and 2 of the letters were in fact written by Plato, although all of the 36 dialogues have some defenders. A further 9 dialogues are ascribed to Plato but were considered spurious even in antiquity. Plato's dialogues feature Socrates, although not always as the leader of the conversation. One dialogue, the Laws, instead contains an Athenian stranger. Along with Xenophon, Plato is the primary source of information about Socrates' life and beliefs, and it is not always easy to distinguish between the two. While the Socrates presented in the dialogues is often taken to be Plato's mouthpiece, Socrates' reputation for irony, his caginess regarding his own opinions in the dialogues, and his occasional absence from or minor role in the conversation serve to conceal Plato's doctrines. Much of what is said about his doctrines is derived from what Aristotle reports about them. The political doctrine ascribed to Plato is derived from the Republic, the Laws, and the Statesman. The first of these contains the suggestion that there will not be justice in cities unless they are ruled by philosopher kings. Those responsible for enforcing the laws are compelled to hold their women, children, and property in common, and the individual is taught to pursue the common good through noble lies. The Republic says that such a city is likely impossible, however, generally assuming that philosophers would refuse to rule and the people would refuse to compel them to do so. Whereas the Republic is premised on a distinction between the sort of knowledge possessed by the philosopher and that possessed by the king or political man, Socrates explores only the character of the philosopher. In The Statesman, on the other hand, a participant referred to as the Eleatic stranger discusses the sort of knowledge possessed by the political man, while Socrates listens quietly. Although rule by a wise man would be preferable to rule by law, the wise cannot help but be judged by the unwise, and so in practice, rule by law is deemed necessary. Both the Republic and the Statesman reveal the limitations of politics, raising the question of what political order would be best given those constraints. That question is addressed in the Laws, a dialogue that does not take place in Athens and from which Socrates is absent. The character of the society described there is eminently conservative, a corrected or liberalized timocracy on the Spartan or Cretan model or that of pre-democratic Athens. Plato's dialogues also have metaphysical themes, the most famous of which is his theory of forms. It holds that non-material abstract but substantial forms are ideas and not the material world of change known to us through our physical senses, possess the highest and most fundamental kind of reality. He argued extensively in the Phaedo, Phaedrus, and Republic for the immortality of the soul, and he believed specifically in reincarnation. Plato often uses long-form analogies, usually allegories, to explain his ideas. The most famous is perhaps the allegory of the cave. It likens most humans to people tied up in a cave, who look only at shadows on the walls and have no other conception of reality. If they turned around, they would see what is casting the shadows and thereby gain a further dimension to their reality. If some left the cave, they would see the outside world illuminated by the sun, representing the ultimate form of goodness and truth. If these travelers then re-entered the cave, the people inside, who are still only familiar with the shadows, would not be equipped to believe reports of this outside world. This story explains the theory of forms with their different levels of reality, and advances the view that philosopher kings are wisest while most humans are ignorant. One student of Plato, Aristotle, who would become another of the most influential philosophers of all time, stressed the implication that understanding relies upon first-hand observation. Aristotelianism. Aristotle moved to Athens from his native Stagira in 367 BC and began to study philosophy, perhaps even rhetoric, under Isocrates, eventually enrolling at Plato's academy. He left Athens approximately 20 years later to study botany and zoology, became a tutor of Alexander the Great, and ultimately returned to Athens a decade later to establish his own school, the Lyceum. At least 29 of his treatises have survived, known as the Corpus Aristotelicum, and address a variety of subjects including logic, physics, optics, metaphysics, ethics, rhetoric, politics, poetry, botany, and zoology. Aristotle is often portrayed as disagreeing with his teacher Plato, e.g., in Raphael's School of Athens. He criticizes the regimes described in Plato's Republic and Laws, and refers to the theory of forms as empty words and poetic metaphors. He is generally presented as giving greater weight to empirical observation and practical concerns. Aristotle's fame was not great during the Hellenistic period, when Stoic logic was in vogue, but later peripatetic commentators popularized his work, which eventually contributed heavily to Islamic, Jewish, and medieval Christian philosophy. His influence was such that Avicenna referred to him simply as the master, Maimonides, Alfarabi, Averroes, and Aquinas as the philosopher. Aristotle opposed the utopian style of theorizing, deciding to rely on the understood and observed behaviors of people in reality to formulate his theories. Stemming from an underlying moral assumption that life is valuable, the philosopher makes a point that scarce resources ought to be responsibly allocated to reduce poverty and death. This fear of goods led Aristotle to exclusively support natural trades in which personal satiation was kept at natural limit of consumption. Unnatural trade, as opposed to the intended limit, was classified as the acquisition of wealth to attain more wealth instead of to purchase more goods. Cutting more along the grain of reality, Aristotle did not only set his mind on how to give people direction to make the right choices but wanted each person equipped with the tools to perform this moral duty. In his own words, property should be in a certain sense common, but, as a general rule, private, for, when everyone has a distinct interest, men will not complain of one another, and they will make more progress because everyone will be attending to his own business. And further, there is the greatest pleasure in doing a kindness or service to friends or guests or companions, which can only be rendered when a man has private property. These advantages are lost by excessive unification of the state. Cynicism. Cynicism, founded by Antisthenes and further developed by Diogenes, emerged as a philosophical movement that sought to live in accordance with nature and in opposition to societal conventions. Antisthenes, a disciple of Socrates, was influenced by Socratic asceticism and criticized Plato for what he perceived as pride and conceit. Diogenes, Antisthenes' contemporary and follower, took these ideas to the extreme by living in utter poverty and engaging in antisocial behavior, famously advocating for a life of simplicity and self-sufficiency. Crates of Thebes, inspired by Diogenes, also embraced a life of voluntary poverty and chose to live on the streets of Athens, renouncing material wealth in pursuit of philosophical truth and virtue. Cyrenaicism. The Cyrenaics were founded by Aristippus of Cyrene, who was a pupil of Socrates. The Cyrenaics were hedonists and held that pleasure was the supreme good in life, especially physical pleasure, which they thought more intense and more desirable than mental pleasures. Pleasure is the only good in life and pain is the only evil. Socrates had held that virtue was the only human good, but he had also accepted a limited role for its utilitarian side, allowing pleasure to be a secondary goal of moral action. Aristippus and his followers seized upon this, and made pleasure the sole final goal of life, denying that virtue had any intrinsic value. Hellenistic and Roman philosophy. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, a diverse array of philosophical schools flourished in the Hellenistic world and later in the Greco-Roman world. This era saw contributions from Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, Syrians, and Arabs, resulting in a rich tapestry of philosophical thought. Additionally, elements of Persian and Indian philosophies also left their mark on Hellenistic philosophy, further enriching its intellectual landscape. Among the notable philosophical schools of this period were the Stoics, Epicureans, Skeptics, and Neoplatonists, each offering distinct perspectives on life, ethics, and metaphysics. The Stoics, for instance, emphasized virtue, resilience, and acceptance of fate as key tenets of their philosophy, while the Epicureans advocated for a life of pleasure and tranquility, albeit through moderation and the avoidance of excess. Skepticism, championed by thinkers like Pyrrho of Elis, called into question the possibility of attaining true knowledge, advocating instead for suspension of judgment and the cultivation of inner tranquility amid the uncertainties of life. Meanwhile, Neoplatonism, influenced by the teachings of Plato, sought to reconcile Platonic metaphysics with other philosophical traditions, incorporating elements of mysticism and spiritual ascent. The spread of Christianity throughout the Roman world, followed by the rise of Islam, marked a significant transition in philosophical thought, leading to the decline of Hellenistic philosophy and the emergence of medieval philosophy. During this period, the intellectual landscape was dominated by the three Abrahamic traditions: Jewish philosophy, Christian philosophy, and early Islamic philosophy, each of which engaged in dialogue with the philosophical legacy of antiquity while also developing distinct theological and metaphysical frameworks. Pyrrhonism. Pyrrho of Elis, a Democritan philosopher, traveled to India with Alexander the Great's army, where Pyrrho was influenced by Buddhist teachings, most particularly the three marks of existence. After returning to Greece, Pyrrho started a new school of philosophy, Pyrrhonism, which taught that it is one's opinions about non-evident matters that prevent one from attaining eudaimonia. Pyrrhonism places the attainment of ataraxia, a state of equanimity, as the way to achieve eudaimonia. To bring the mind to ataraxia, Pyrrhonism uses epichay, suspension of judgment regarding all non-evident propositions. Pyrrhonists dispute that the dogmatists, which includes all of Pyrrhonism's rival philosophies, have found truth regarding non-evident matters. For any non-evident matter, a Pyrrhonist makes arguments for and against such that the matter cannot be concluded, thus suspending belief and thereby inducing ataraxia. Epicureanism. Epicurus, a prominent philosopher of the Hellenistic period, studied in Athens under the guidance of Nausiphanes, who was a follower of Democritus and a student of Pyrrho of Elis. Epicurus embraced Democritus' theory of atomism, which posited that all matter is composed of indivisible particles called atoms, but he also made improvements to the theory in response to criticisms from philosophers like Aristotle. One of the central tenets of Epicurus' philosophy was his ethical doctrine, which revolved around the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. However, Epicurus' concept of pleasure was nuanced and differed from simple hedonism. He emphasized that true pleasure is not found in the indulgence of sensual desires or extravagant living, but rather in the absence of physical pain and mental distress. Epicurus distinguished between different types of pleasures, advocating for a life of moderation and tranquility. He believed that cultivating inner peace and contentment, rather than the pursuit of fleeting pleasures, leads to the highest form of happiness. This emphasis on mental tranquility and freedom from anxiety is encapsulated in Epicurus' famous dictum: "We do not mean the pleasures of the prodigal or of sensuality, we mean the absence of pain in the body and trouble in the mind." Stoicism. The founder of Stoicism, Zeno of Citium, was taught by Crates of Thebes, and he took up the Cynic ideals of continence and self-mastery, but applied the concept of apatheia, indifference, to personal circumstances rather than social norms, and switched shameless flouting of the latter for a resolute fulfillment of social duties. Logic and physics were also part of early Stoicism, further developed by Zeno's successors Cleanthes and Chrysippus. Their metaphysics was based in materialism, which was structured by logos, reason, but also called God or fate. Their logical contributions still feature in contemporary propositional calculus. Their ethics was based on pursuing happiness, which they believed was a product of living in accordance with nature. This meant accepting those things which one could not change. One could therefore choose whether to be happy or not by adjusting one's attitude towards their circumstances, as the freedom from fears and desires was happiness itself. Platonism. Academic skepticism. Around 266 BC, Arcesilaus assumed leadership of the Platonic Academy and introduced skepticism as a central tenet of Platonism, effectively aligning Platonism with Pyrrhonism. This marked the beginning of a skeptical period within ancient Platonism, known as the New Academy. Although some ancient authors recognized further subdivisions, such as a Middle Academy, the overarching characteristic of this period was skepticism. Unlike Pyrrhonism, which aimed for ataraxia, tranquility, as its central objective, the academic skeptics, following Arcesilaus, did not prioritize ataraxia. Instead, they focused on critiquing the dogmas of other philosophical schools, particularly the Stoics' dogmatism. While they acknowledged the existence of truth, they doubted humanity's capacity to attain it, drawing from Plato's Phaedo, where Socrates discusses the limitations of mortal knowledge. The academic skeptics emphasized a practical philosophical moderation, contrasting with the psychological objectives of the Pyrrhonists. They recognized some semblance of a moral law within, albeit as a plausible guide rather than absolute truth. This distinction between the sage and the fool, based on possession of this moral law, underscored their approach to ethics and epistemology. Overall, while there may seem to be slight differences between the positions of the academic skeptics and the Pyrrhonists, the practical philosophical moderation of the former is evident in their focus on critique and their nuanced approach to moral guidance and epistemological inquiry. Middle Platonism. Following the end of the skeptical period of the Academy with Antiochus of Ascalon, Platonic thought entered the period of Middle Platonism, which absorbed ideas from the Peripatetic and Stoic schools. More extreme syncretism was done by Numenius of Apamea, who combined it with Neopythagoreanism. Neoplatonism. From Plotinus onwards, the Neoplatonists believed that mind was prior to matter and that the universe had a single cause, which for them was also a single mind. This philosophy later influenced Christian theology and Gnosticism, effectively transforming Neoplatonism into a religion. Greek ideas were mostly forgotten in Western Europe during the Middle Ages due to illiteracy. However, in the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, Greek ideas were preserved and studied. In this regard, Islamic philosophers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd clarified Greek works that subsequently got translated by Arabic to Latin. These reintroduced philosophies greatly influenced medieval philosophers like Thomas Aquinas. Thank you for watching our video.